It started on the archetypes. Should we start on some of the very sort of or some of the main ones that we come across in life? Maybe the mother and father.
So the idea of an archetype is essentially it's like a shell, and then we fill that shell or that vessel with our own experiences and our own interactions with various versions of that archetype. And they are a kind of a fundamental plank for Jung's work. And when he first introduced them, they were greeted with universal derision. And the idea of having something that was preformed or a primordial image was very problematic. And there is a kind of historical precedent for this idea of having a symbol or an archetypal energy. And when Jung kind of was working on them, he basically said that he had rediscovered them. It wasn't necessarily his own particular kind of insight, but there were historical precedents before, and the archetype is very much tied in with the kind of collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is that part of the conscious which is inherited by virtue of the fact that we are all human, and throughout the span of our existence on the planet, we have built up this kind of back catalogue of interactions with various symbolic kind of energies, which, for want of another name, is called an archetype. So the archetype can be multi-layered, well, is always multi-layered, and primal kind of archetypes would be, say, mother and father. Mm-hmm. But within those two categories, you get so many different layers and so many different aspects to the father, or so many different aspects to the mother. So our own experiences or our own interactions with the archetypes are very much based on personal experience. And my experience of the mother archetype may be very different to someone else's, and in fact probably is. And the fact that we all know what a mother is, and we've had mothers from the beginning of time, we've had fathers. So the idea of the archetype is built up over the millennia.
Yeah, so that there's like the collective idea of the mother, which is dualistic, like everything. Every archetype and everything is dualistic. But then there's also the personal experience. So like where a person might have had maybe a negative experience of what their mother was. Maybe their mother was abusive. There's also the collective idea of what the mother is: the nurturer, the giver of life. The homemaker, the comfort, the care. Which then goes on to build up their anima, but it becomes tainted because obviously the personal experience of the mother was negative, and that can be very difficult for them. So they're within every archetype, I guess there's the personal experience and then also the collective. And as you said very well, that it is innate. It's kind of born within us, this idea. And I guess it's also where the idea of like the gods came from. The gods in all of their archetypal form, and so we have one god, called Hermes in one place, and then Thoth in another, and they're kind of given different names in different places.
The idea of the archetype as well being something that's innate. The psyche does have a kind of an inbuilt propensity to kind of group together. So when you're thinking of an archetype is under that kind of grouping thing where so many different facets of the archetype will be bound together. And the archetype also has its positive pole and its negative pole. And when we experience the archetype can just be something recognizable, something outside ourselves. But when we kind of experience that personal archetypal power, it's accompanied by this feeling of luminosity, this kind of otherworldliness, and it becomes almost like a spiritual or a transcendent experience. Mm-hmm. It has a power that is beyond. Jung said archetypes permeate the psyche, but they are not its property. So they exist outside of human consciousness in the sense that they don't need us to exist, but we use our consciousness to recognize them.
Wow.
It's all very
Okay.
mystical.
It is. It's like a magic, and I can understand what he means there. Like, I guess that, like, in terms of experiencing the archetype as numinous. I guess even if you come across someone who, let's just say, kind of a motherly type, or even just a new friend or acquaintance, and they give off this kind of loving, caring, sort of warm, they have these attributes. You get the
Yeah,
sense of the archetype, don't you? You get the sense, and we
you do.
like it. And like you
Mm.
said, within every archetype, there's, I guess the word spectrum comes to mind. There's like kind of different spectrums of, I guess, that duality.
Mm. There's also a feeling with the archetype that the argument runs that we do not necessarily need to experience luminosity when we engage with the archetype. But one of the characteristic kind of feelings around archetypal engagement would be the luminous. But you can have an archetypal connection without having that luminosity. And the idea of the archetype being both negative and positive, these poles, the danger is that they are very persuasive, and we can identify with that archetype, and we can identify with either the positive pole or with the negative pole. And you often find, for example, if you have, say, the warrior, or you have, say, the wise man, or somebody who fancies themselves as being the fountain of all wisdom, when you get identifying yourself with the negative pole, you become very rigid, very opinionated. You become very much more about I'm right and everyone else is wrong, and I know the way forward. So any fundamentalist or any fanatical religious or those kind of people who are extremely intolerant of dissent or questioning, you can see they've identified completely with that negative pole of that archetype, and it drives them and it fills them, and there's no way they can escape it, because it's very dangerous and very persuasive and will imprison us if need be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I can really see that. I mean, I guess whenever this is why this kind of study is so important. Carl Jung's study about the archetypes, and all of his work in regard to individuation. Is because if we don't know these things, then we'll never see them within ourselves. And if someone is very sort of highly opinionated, and like you said, the warrior type, and identifies so much with that. The balance isn't there anymore, and this is where we all need to be, is we need to find balance. And where we see ourselves too much in one archetype, then we have to maybe look at the polar opposite and then try and find a way to get back again. And that can also dent the ego, because that warrior archetype, if we identify with that too much, it can really kind of, that's why it becomes so persuasive, especially if it's something that we want to be and that's we're highly aspired to in society. Or even just, as an idea as a child, this idea of warrior and hero of everyone, it can drive us to continue in that cycle. Where balance really is needed.
There's a very interesting experience to be gained from doing, say, an archetype test. There are a number of them around, but all it's really doing is it's giving you an insight into what may be your dominant archetypes for this period of your life. And we have kind of different archetypes that may guide us throughout our lives, as we were talking about before, this idea that they return. So we may rediscover an aspect to the archetype that has long been forgotten. And a dominant archetype can really inform a major part of your life. And it's, I think, really useful to understand which archetypes might be present at a particular stage in your life. So say the hero out on the great heroic journey, this may have been something that informed your life when you were younger, and then you kind of lost track, or you lost sight of that, and then it'll return, he or she will return in later life, where again that restlessness reappears, and that sense of wanting to explore and wanting to move and wanting to leave everything behind becomes very much more pressing. So archetypes can zoom in and out of our lives at any point, and I find that quite exciting, because you can reconnect with an earlier kind of fountain of energy that perhaps had been forgotten.
There is one that keeps coming to mind about the martyr, about like maybe someone who is maybe trying to, I don't know, gain approval from other people, and so they work their arse off trying to please everyone at the expense of themselves, and then they end up being very resentful and hostile, and that's when, like, I don't know, that's when the shadow comes out. It kind of comes out and it bites back in different ways, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Mm.
The idea as well that if you have the victim archetype per se, the victim archetype will always kind of blame others and will always have, I mean, I know it's, people do have horrific experiences, and there is always that feeling that we have to try and survive that. That's the more positive pole of the victim, is that we are a survivor rather than having something that will completely dominate our lives. And we become the eternal victim. But you can also have kind of petty victim archetypes, wrong, and there's nothing here, purely rather than working towards the more positive pole where we are able to survive and we are able to overcome certain grievances. A lot of people get stuck with that negative pole, and that's where the persuasiveness comes in, because it's very difficult to move away from that once we buy into it.
And I find a lot of people that start shadow work, and I know for myself as well, I very much felt like a victim, and it was unconscious. It was unconscious because it was fed to me as a child. It was fed to me, and then it was like, and I did identify, as much as I was kind of pushing away from it, I also identified unconsciously with it. And I find that a lot of people that start off with shadow work are there too, that they're in that idea, that sort of mentality of, you know, they did this to me and I, you know, poor me, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's not to belittle it, but it's most definitely something that I find in the early stages of shadow work, and an important thing to realize.
Yeah.
You know, the breakthrough that comes, and it's no point in me saying, you know, you're going to have a breakthrough. They need to actually go through the process and get to it themselves, and have that kind of, I guess, that numinous moment of, oh, okay, I see what really happened. I pulled apart all of the lies, you know, and all of I can see what really happened. And, you know, that's a huge stage, I think.
Mm-hmm. Some of the guiding archetypes, I mean, there's this idea that there's hundreds of them. And then what's also quite interesting is how you've got these kind of cultural archetypes, perhaps, that they weren't present in earlier kind of societies or communities, but then you get the universal ones, which kind of are relevant across the ages. But you could have, say, an archetypal kind of representation of, say, social media bunny, someone who is a social influencer. Now, this is a kind of a new archetypal kind of theme that wouldn't have been relevant or would have existed even, say, 30 years ago. So the interesting thing about archetypes is that they do emerge, and there are new ones that are kind of like evolving.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I remember somebody saying that an archetype is a mini stereotype.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, people always they get very offended by this idea of stereotypes, but I think they're very useful, and I think we need them. And I think that even if people get offended by them, we have them anyway. You know, we can't help but to associate things with other things that are real and true, and so that's where the stereotype comes. But I mean, I know that they can also be offensive. They can, you know, there are certain ways that they can, that, you know, don't clone me as you know, a white girl with brown hair.
Yeah.
But yeah,
The
it's very
idea
interesting. Sorry, go on.
The idea of the archetypes, well, for me, is very much about when you have you've got a reference point, so you can begin to understand how that's playing out, because the archetype, as we said, was kind of like, is the vessel, and we're filling up the vessel with our own kind of experiences and our interpretation of that archetype. So when I see, like, typical, I can say, well, that's very much an archetypal kind of expression. So, for example, the jester, when you think of the jester as an archetype, when you're looking at, say, the negative pole of jester, the jester is very much pure pleasure-seeking, party, party, party. Whereas the positive pole of the jester is very much more about someone with a good sense of humor, but there's a sense of proportion to that. So when you're looking at behaviors, it's quite interesting to see where the archetype actually manifests.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a lot of resistance to this idea of having, yeah, well, if we have an archetype, that means that there's no real kind of freedom to behavior, and we're putting everyone in boxes and we're labeling and we're pigeonholing. But I don't see that as being necessarily a limiting thing. It's always interesting how the archetype helps us to understand where someone's coming from. And once we can understand other people's dominant archetypes, that also helps us to understand how we are responding to those dominant archetypes. And then, well, what dominant archetype is informing our lives at this time?
Okay. Right, so that's a very interesting way to look at it. So you mentioned the 12 different archetypes. Do you want to go through that? And you also mentioned about how they can how they can assist us through our passage through life.
Yeah. So, for example, you've got one of the most dominant archetypes is caregiver. Then we have, for example, the lover. We have the sage, the wise man or the wise woman. We have the jester, the warrior. We have the ruler. We have the destroyer. When you, for example, identify with the negative pole of the destroyer, you find that you get this kind of self-destructive behavior. You sabotage everything. And ultimately, on the worst, darkest point of that pole, there would be, say, self-harming and even suicide. This idea that the archetypes can also reconnect and interconnect with each other. So you might find it's not uncommon to have 3 or 4 dominant archetypes working as a group. So you might find that there's this kind of moral struggle between one archetype as opposed to the other archetype that's informing your life at this time as well. So it's really important to kind of get a clearer idea of what are these archetypal energies and how are they informing my life at this time, because Jung was very keen to say that, you know, all we can really do, or the best we can do with our lives, is to just develop a conscious attitude to what's going on now, and also to what is the unconscious saying to us, and what does it want, and how is it saying that?
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned that the destroyer archetype. I guess the positive aspect of that is that sometimes we need to destroy, don't we? We need to
Yes.
we need to break things. We need to break relationships. We need to break up. We need to break contracts with with people, or with jobs or whatever. So it also has its positive as well.
It does, yeah. All archetypes have the positive and negative poles. So I think shadow as well is when we kind of are identifying with the negative pole, but we don't know that this is actually happening. And because they are so powerful and they are so they run so deep, it can be very difficult to disconnect from that and to find the positive or the light pole. So, for example, if you've had a very rough or very difficult relationship with your father, all you've really experienced of the father archetype will be that dark negative pole. So it's very important, again, for spiritual balance to turn and find the light pole. And by finding the lighter aspects to the father archetype, therein lies forgiveness. And it's the same with any of the archetypes. If we have the really dark, ugly stuff, then we have no real notion of how healing and how wonderful the positive poles of those archetypes can be.
Mm-hmm. No, I fight with myself about this idea of forgiveness sometimes, because I mean it seems to be like a big thing in like the New Age community that you know, in order to move on and to not carry the hate or the, you know, the pain inside of you, that you have to forgive. And I'm usually of the mind that you shouldn't forgive, actually. Not always. I think it depends. But this is where I fight with myself, because lately I've been thinking about maybe actually to forgive, even if it's not been said to the person directly, but just to forgive within yourself, because you know how everyone can be, because you know about your shadow, and so you know that, you know, everyone's sort of everyone is capable of as good as much as bad.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but I do fight with myself about this idea, and more, I'd say sort of more recently I've been thinking about the idea of, you know, maybe forgiveness is something that should take place. But before then, the other thing is that with this is that if you forgive everything, then you're also forgiving evil, and there is a lot of evil in the world, and some
Sure.
things actually shouldn't be forgiven, I think, and some things need to be kind of pulled up to question and said what, you know, what they really are. So yeah, I have sort of mixed ideas about the idea of forgiveness, but that's just my own
The
idea.
the obverse to forgiveness perhaps is punishment. So how far do you go in terms of, okay, I'm not going to forgive you, but what am I going to do about that? And it's, I mean, I do agree with you. There are certain things which are absolutely unforgivable, and there are certain things which are so bad that they, our immediate instinctive response would be to punish that.
Mm-hmm.
But forgiveness is, I don't really understand it myself, because is forgiveness about, okay, you did this, therefore I'm going to do that to redress or
Mm-hmm.
achieve some kind of balance? Or is forgiveness about, okay, you did that, but it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's more of the way that I've sort of dealt with it is that I kind of would say perhaps just distance myself from someone if I felt that someone has you know, wronged me in a way that I felt was unforgivable. Then
Mm-hmm.
then I, as has happened, you know, to most people, I've sort of taken myself away, and sometimes I fight myself with the idea that maybe that is actually sort of punishment in itself. But then again, you know, fill your own cup first, I always say. And I think, you know, we have to put ourselves first in all situations. Otherwise, we can't give to anyone else and we can't help anyone else.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, it's a tricky thing. And I guess maybe every situation is different. I guess you need to kind of work on it on that basis, maybe.
Mm-hmm. What's also interesting about the archetype is that they,
Oh, sorry, David, I've lost you there. Hello, I think you've gone. Oh dear. Oh dear, David has gone. That's not good. Hopefully he'll be coming back in a minute. His computer sorts its